Imagine receiving a letter from the government telling you that your hometown would soon disappear forever. Not because an enemy was coming, not because a river had overflowed, but because officials had decided to build a lake directly over it. Your home would be demolished. Your church would be taken apart. Your children's school would close. Even the cemetery where your family had rested for generations might have to be moved. It sounds almost impossible. Yet during the 1930s, thousands of American families faced exactly that reality. Entire communities were ordered to leave so that massive reservoirs could be created. Within months, towns that had existed for generations were wiped from the map not by nature, but by one of the largest engineering projects in American history. Today, millions of people fish, boat, and swim on these lakes without realizing what lies beneath them. Hidden below the surface are old streets, stone foundations, abandoned bridges, forgotten churches, and the remains of communities that once bustled with everyday life. Then something unexpected began to happen. During years of severe drought, as the water slowly receded, pieces of those lost towns started to appear again. A staircase leading to a house that no longer exists. A cracked sidewalk ending at open water. The foundation of a church where hymns were once sung every Sunday. These weren't legends. They were real places. Briefly returning to daylight before disappearing beneath the lakes once again, how did entire American towns end up underwater, and what can the ruins still tell us today? To answer those questions, we have to travel back to one of the most difficult periods in American history. The year was 1938. Although the country was beginning to recover from the Great Depression, millions of Americans were still struggling. Jobs remained scarce, farms were failing, and many rural communities lived without electricity. At the same time, powerful rivers continued to flood towns and farmland year after year. Families rebuilt their homes only to watch them wash away again with the next major storm. The nation needed solutions. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal launched some of the largest public works projects America had ever seen. Roads, bridges, schools, and enormous dams designed to control rivers, generate electricity, and create new opportunities for struggling communities. One organization stood at the center of this effort, the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA. Created in 1933, the TVA had an ambitious mission: tame dangerous rivers, reduce flooding, improve river navigation, and bring affordable electricity to millions of people across the Tennessee Valley. For many Americans, the results were life-changing. Homes that had relied on kerosene lamps switched on electric lights for the first time. Factories opened. New jobs appeared. Modern life reached rural communities that had been left behind for decades. It was a remarkable achievement, but every reservoir came with a hidden cost. Before a lake could be created, an entire valley had to disappear. Government engineers spread large maps across their desks and drew new shorelines in blue ink. Everything inside those lines would soon be underwater. Homes, barns, churches, schools, railroad tracks, fields, roads, sometimes entire towns. Survey crews visited communities one by one, measuring property and recording every building that stood in the future flood zone. Families were told they would be compensated for their land and helped relocate. For some, it was a practical decision. For others, it felt like losing part of their identity. A house could be rebuilt. A business could reopen. But the place where your grandparents were married, where your children were born, where generations of your family had gathered every Sunday, that could never be replaced. One resident later recalled watching workers place survey markers through his family's fields. He said that was the moment he realized the town was already beginning to disappear, even though the river had not yet risen. Across the valley, the same quiet scenes unfolded again and again. Families packed their belongings. Neighbors said goodbye. Children left behind the only homes they had ever known. Most Americans celebrated the new dams as symbols of progress. Very few stopped to think about the communities that had quietly sacrificed everything to make them possible. But history has a remarkable way of returning when we least expect it. Because decades later, when record droughts lowered the reservoirs, the water exposed something no one thought they would ever see again. The streets of those forgotten towns had been waiting beneath the surface all along. Before the water erased these towns, life continued almost as it always had. Children walked the same dirt roads to school every morning. Church bells echoed across the valley every Sunday. Neighbours stopped to talk outside the general store. Farmers worked fields their families had owned for generations. No one imagined that within a few years nearly everything around them would disappear beneath a man-made lake. The first signs of change were not rising rivers. They were men carrying measuring equipment. Government surveyors arrived with maps, notebooks, and long steel chains used to measure property lines. They walked through farms, crossed front yards, and placed wooden stakes into the ground. At first, many residents assumed it was another routine land survey. Then the letters arrived. Each letter carried the same difficult message. The land had been selected for a future reservoir. Families would receive payment for their property, but eventually they would have to leave. For many, it was the hardest news they had ever received. Some quietly accepted the decision. They understood why the dams were being built. Seasonal flooding had destroyed crops, bridges, and homes for decades. Reliable electricity promised a better future for millions of Americans. But understanding the project did not lessen the heartbreak of leaving home. One local newspaper described entire families standing on their front porches. Looking across fields they knew they would never harvest again. Others walked to nearby cemeteries to visit loved ones one last time before the relocation began. These were not just buildings, they were memories. Every church held weddings, funerals, and baptisms stretching back generations. Every schoolhouse carried the voices of children who had grown into parents and grandparents. Every front porch had witnessed birthdays, family gatherings, and quiet summer evenings. Those memories could not be packed into moving trucks. As the months passed, the valley slowly began to empty. Businesses closed one after another. The local blacksmith locked his workshop for the last time. The general store sold its final supplies. The small railroad depot, once busy with passengers and freight, fell silent as tracks were prepared for removal. Even schools held final classes before students transferred to neighbouring communities. Teachers carefully packed books into wooden boxes. Desks were loaded onto trucks. Children exchanged addresses, promising to stay in touch. Many never saw one another again. Perhaps the most emotional chapter involved the cemeteries. Before the reservoirs could be filled, thousands of graves had to be carefully relocated to higher ground. This was done with extraordinary care. Every headstone was recorded, every burial was documented. Families were invited to attend if they wished. For many, it felt like saying goodbye twice. One elderly resident later remembered standing beside his grandfather's grave as workers carefully lifted the stone. He said the silence that morning was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Even the birds seemed quiet. Meanwhile, construction continued at an astonishing pace. Thousands of workers laboured day and night, pouring concrete into forms that seemed almost impossibly large. Towering cranes lifted steel into place. Massive floodgates were installed. Each week, the dams grew taller. Newspapers celebrated them as symbols of American determination during the Great Depression. Few headlines mentioned the communities disappearing in their shadow. Finally, the day arrived. The floodgates closed. At first, almost nothing seemed different. The river widened slightly. Low pastures filled with shallow water. Creeks became small lakes. Then the water kept rising. Week after week it climbed higher. Fence posts disappeared. Country roads vanished beneath muddy water. Barns stood surrounded by rising lakes until only their roofs remained. Church steeples reflected in the growing reservoir before slipping beneath the surface. One by one, the towns disappeared. Maps were redrawn, road signs were removed, new shorelines replaced old neighborhoods. Within months, places that had existed for generations were gone. To the rest of America, the story was over. The dams were complete, the reservoirs were full. The lost towns became little more than faded photographs in family albums, but history has a strange habit of refusing to stay buried. Decades later, when historic droughts lowered the reservoirs to levels not seen in generations, something extraordinary emerged from the mud. Not treasure, not a forgotten civilization, something far more personal. The streets where thousands of ordinary Americans had once lived were waiting to be seen again. For years, the lakes appeared peaceful. People launched fishing boats from quiet marinas. Children learned to swim along sandy shores. Cabins and campgrounds replaced the farms that had once filled the valleys. To most visitors, these lakes looked completely natural. Very few realized they were floating above forgotten neighborhoods. Beneath the calm water lay roads that no longer appeared on maps. Stone foundations where homes once stood. Church steps leading to buildings that had vanished decades earlier. Entire communities rested silently below the surface. Then, nature did something no engineer could control. The water began to fall. During several historic droughts, reservoirs across the southeastern United States dropped to levels not seen in decades. As shorelines slowly pulled back, the landscape began revealing something extraordinary. At first, it was only a few scattered stones. Then sections of old roads appeared. Soon after, visitors noticed rows of brick foundations emerging from the mud. What many first assumed were random ruins soon proved to be something much more remarkable. These were the forgotten streets of towns that had disappeared nearly a century earlier. For local families, the discoveries were deeply emotional. Many had grown up listening to stories told by parents and grandparents about places they had never seen. Now, for the first time, those stories had a landscape. One woman carried an old family photograph taken outside her grandparents' home shortly before the town was evacuated. Standing along the exposed shoreline, she compared the picture with the stone foundation in front of her. The chimney was gone. The porch had disappeared. But the outline of the house matched perfectly. She quietly said, "This is where my grandmother used to wave goodbye every morning." Moments like these began happening across several reservoirs. Older residents walked carefully through the mud, pointing toward places only they remembered. This was the barber shop. That's where the school stood. The church was just over there. To everyone else, it looked like scattered ruins. To them, it was home. Historians quickly recognized the importance of these rare moments, because the exposed remains would not stay visible for long. Archaeological teams arrived with cameras, GPS equipment, historic maps, and notebooks. Every exposed wall, road, bridge support, and foundation was carefully photographed before rising water covered it once again. Unlike treasure hunters, archaeologists were not searching for valuable objects. They were preserving stories. Old engineering maps were compared with modern drone images. Historic aerial photographs were placed beside new satellite surveys. Slowly, the outlines of entire communities began to reappear. Researchers could identify schools, churches, general stores, mills, even neighborhoods that had disappeared from official maps generations earlier. Modern technology revealed even more. Using sonar, researchers scanned beneath the surface without disturbing the lake bed. The images showed roads still following their original routes. Stone bridge foundations remained standing. Some building foundations were remarkably well preserved after decades underwater. Each discovery confirmed what local families had always known. Their towns had never completely disappeared. They had simply been hidden beneath the reservoirs. One of the most moving discoveries involved old orchards. In a few locations, rows of fruit trees were still growing near the shoreline, although many original buildings had long since collapsed. The trees continued producing fruit decades after the families who planted them had gone. To descendants, those trees felt like living witnesses to a forgotten community. They reminded visitors that these towns had not been abandoned because people wanted to leave. They had been asked to sacrifice their homes for a project that leaders believed would benefit millions of Americans. And in many ways it did. The dams reduced devastating floods, they generated electricity, they supported industries, they transformed entire regions. But progress always leaves footprints. Sometimes those footprints remain hidden beneath water for generations. Then, when the lake quietly retreats, history steps back into the sunlight. Yet perhaps the greatest discovery was not an old road or a stone foundation. It was something much harder to measure. Memory, because every exposed building brought back another story. Every uncovered street reminded someone of a childhood friend. Every forgotten church foundation recalled weddings, funerals, and Sunday mornings that had almost been lost to time. The lakes had covered the towns, but they had never erased the people who remembered them. And in the final chapter of this investigation, we'll ask the question that still divides historians today. Were these sacrifices worth the price? And what should America remember about the communities that disappeared so the nation could move forward? As the lakes slowly rose in the late 1930s, America celebrated a remarkable engineering achievement. Newspapers praised the massive dams. Politicians called them symbols of progress. Electricity reached rural homes that had lived in darkness for generations. Factories expanded. Flood damage dropped dramatically. To much of the country, the project was a complete success. But beneath those calm waters, another story remained almost invisible. It was the story of ordinary Americans whose hometowns had quietly disappeared. Today, nearly 90 years later, historians are still piecing those stories back together, not from myths, not from legends, but from family photographs, faded letters, county records, engineering maps, church registers, and interviews with the last people who remember those towns before the water came. Every document tells part of the story. An old wedding photograph identifies the location of a church that no longer exists. A handwritten diary records the final Sunday service before a congregation moved to higher ground. A faded map shows roads now hidden beneath 50 feet of water. One memory fills a gap left by another. Slowly, the forgotten communities return not physically, but historically. Modern archaeology has become one of the most important tools in that effort. Unlike the archaeologists of a century ago, today's researchers can study submerged landscapes without disturbing them. Using drones, they photograph exposed ruins during periods of low water. With sonar, they create detailed images of roads, bridges, and building foundations still resting on the lake floor. Historic maps are compared with satellite imagery, allowing researchers to rebuild entire neighborhoods on a computer screen. What once seemed lost can now be studied with remarkable accuracy, and the discoveries continue to surprise even experienced historians. Stone foundations remain exactly where families left them. Sections of old roads still connect places that no longer exist. Bridge supports rise from the mud whenever the reservoirs reach unusually low levels. In some places, visitors can still follow the outline of a neighborhood simply by looking at the remaining foundations. It is a powerful reminder that history rarely disappears completely. Sometimes it simply waits to be found again. For descendants of the families who lived there, these places mean far more than archaeological sites. Many return carrying old family albums. They stand where grandparents once owned a small farm. They point toward an empty field and quietly say, "Our house stood right there." Children who only knew the stories suddenly see them become real. The memories passed down around kitchen tables finally have a landscape. Perhaps that is why these places continue to attract historians, descendants, and curious travelers alike. Not because they are mysterious, but because they remind us how quickly familiar places can vanish, and how easily the lives of ordinary people can fade from the national story. Looking back today, historians generally agree on one important truth. The dams changed America. They reduced destructive flooding. They brought affordable electricity to millions. They improved transportation along major rivers. They helped fuel economic growth during one of the nation's most difficult periods. Those achievements were real, but so were the sacrifices. Thousands of families left homes their ancestors had built. Entire communities disappeared beneath rising reservoirs. Churches where generations had worshipped were lost. Schools where children learned their first lessons were abandoned. History asks us to remember both sides of that story, because progress and sacrifice often exist together. One cannot always be understood without the other. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden beneath these lakes. When we visit a quiet reservoir today, we often admire the water, the forests, and the peaceful shoreline. Rarely do we imagine the streets below, the front porches, the gardens, the laughter of children walking home from school. Yet those lives are still part of the American landscape, even if they can no longer be seen. Every drought that briefly uncovers an old road or a forgotten foundation reminds us that the past is never as far away as we think. It waits beneath the surface, patient, silent, and ready to tell its story again. And perhaps that is why these 4 flooded towns still matter today. Not because they hid a forgotten treasure, not because they concealed an ancient mystery, but because they remind us that America's history was built not only by famous leaders and great engineering projects, but also by ordinary families who gave up everything so the country could move forward. The lakes covered their homes, time erased their streets, but neither could erase their story. Thank you for joining us on the Vertical Archive. If you enjoy authentic documentaries about forgotten America, archaeology, lost communities, historic engineering, and the hidden stories preserved in old archives, consider subscribing. Because somewhere beneath another lake, inside another faded photograph, or buried in another forgotten government report, America's next untold story is still waiting to be uncovered.